it's giving us a more fulsome picture of the kinds of implications that are required to implement the research as cares and cares research concepts. So with us, we also have Dr. Sébastien Perreault, who is an associate professor in pediatric neurology and neuro-oncology at CHU Sainte-Justine, one of the largest, as I've come to learn, mother and child centers in Canada, and one of the four most important pediatric centers in North America, which I hadn't been aware of. Don Husereau is an adjunct professor in medicine at the University of Ottawa. He does freelance healthcare research and works with both private and public sector life sciences. Welcome. We also have Dr. Sushmita Pamidi, who's a respirologist and sleep physician. Probably one of your most important functions with sleep being so profiled in so many healthcare papers these days, and an associate professor of medicine at McGill University. She is also co-chair of the Accelerating Clinical Trial Consortium's Clinical Trial Unit at the Institute of the McGill University Health Center. And we welcome back Dr. Dean Fergusson as well to this panel. Over to Michael.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. So, as Anne-Marie mentioned, these two sessions are very much related. So we just finished a conversation about the cultural shift, the human aspect of what is required to bring research to care and care to research. What we're going to be talking about is just in simplistic terms, it's the systems. It's the operations, the logistics, what are the financial, economic implications of this shift. But I also want to take a different approach. So, you know, over the 9 years of being a part of this conference, I recognize sort of the power of the audience as well as the power of the panelists. And so we're right before lunch. We'd love to make you work for your lunch. So what we're going to do is I'm going to have each of the panelists speak a little bit about what they think are going to be the system's implications, the system requirements to bring this to life. Just a few minutes on each from each of the panelists, but then I would really like the audience to come up and ask as many questions and contribute as many comments as possible. Even yesterday in the small group conversations, I recognize there's so much curiosity, so much knowledge out there. I want to bring you in as part of the conversation as well, because we've touched on all these topics over the last day and a half. So let's bring this into as like a big, I always say this meeting it feels like family getting back together. So let's bring it back and let's bring everyone into the conversation. So I'll start a little bit. We'll go through the panelists, and then, you know, I do have some questions in case everyone's shy, but I know this group isn't shy, so come on up and ask questions. The piece that I just wanted to say is over the last day and a half, we've talked a lot about research is care, bringing clinical trials into clinical practice, bringing more of these research programs that are available into into hospitals and how we deliver care to patients. The other important aspect that some have touched on and some others, you know, I feel we can emphasize more is, and part of what I do day to day is care being research as well. So the notion of real world data, the notion of being able to provide care through routine clinical practice, but then having access to the data that we are collecting from patients through routine clinical practice so we can better understand the care that we're providing, so that we can conduct more research. I've been a leader at Roche managing our entire research portfolio from the Canadian perspective, and I would say as much as we do try to bring global clinical trials to Canada, the proportion of research that we do as a Canadian affiliate, we do a significant amount of significally more observational studies and real-world data studies and outcomes research. So if we can also think about how do we build the infrastructure for care, you know, creating research, creating knowledge, creating evidence, I think that's another opportunity for us as a country to bring this vision to life. So that's what I wanted to say there, but I would like to ask my panelists to speak a little bit more from your perspective, from your experience, what are sort of those logistics, operational systems implications that we should be aware of as we try to bring research as care and care is research to life? Maybe we'll just go down the line. Dean?
Okay, so on the logistics regulatory front, Susan spoke to the need to have efficient ethics and a single entry system to improve, approval times. I think related to that is in terms of contracts, when it comes to clinical trial agreements and contracts for specimen and data transfer, multi-site. We've made really good progress there, and there are master templates and master agreements that we can take advantage of. Those two things combined will help us Canada be a place of business for trials if we can guarantee, turnaround times of, whatever it is, 30 days, 45 days. That makes a huge difference. It tracks industry, and it makes it easier for our own academic research community as well. So that would be on the system logistics. At the hospital system level or healthcare system level, to me, it's that a research patient is treated no differently than any other patient in terms of coming through the doors, getting the lab work, getting the pharmacy, getting the imaging. It shouldn't be treated as separate. So not separate slots, usually at night or on the weekend for an MRI or a CT scan. It should be built into routine care. And, on the back end, we can take care of the financing and accounting of all that and who pays for what. But at the patient facing, they should see it being seamless with care. And I'll leave it at that. Those are my sort of high-level thoughts.
Thank you. I guess I can provide more perspective wearing two hats. Really, it should be one hat, but really, I think it is still two hats. I'm a clinician. So I see patients in clinic as well as in the emergency room and other acute care settings at a quaternary care center. I think it's important to highlight that last piece because there's a lot of disparity in what happens at academic health centers as well as community hospitals as well as clinics, outpatient clinics in rural regions, and I think we do need to address that. And then I'm also a researcher. So, and at our institute, we have a research institute, we have a hospital. And yes, they work together. I was really interested in the conversations about institutional leadership and, of course, culture change, and all of that is important. But I think fundamentally it comes down to when you're sitting in front of a patient in your clinic and you have a wait list and you have patients waiting there, they're waiting for an hour, you need to get the job done. And your job as a clinician, with my clinician hat, is to do the best you can for that patient that's in front of you and prioritize that patient and all the questions they have around that immediate care. And part of that care is giving them the opportunity to have access to all the treatments, which includes clinical trials. But there's a huge disconnect with having access to that information, that making it logistically possible for me to enroll that patient in a clinical trial. I need to know what are the eligibility criteria, what are the trials, what is the disease state, where's the coordinator, am I going to call the coordinator, is that going to eat into my time? Like, these are just really fundamental logistical operational bottlenecks that somehow I think we need to think about how to address those. And maybe it's AI, digital innovation, and using, and we did talk about EHRs earlier. There's also an issue there because electronic health records are really still variable between institutions based on provincial legislation as well. So Quebec, we're still waiting to get EPIC, for example. I have used that in the US and it's excellent, and there's a health record and an app and you can opt in, opt out. So there's a lot of still disparities, not only within a province, but between provinces. And now again, I'll go back to clinics. So how does a family doctor do this in a rural clinic in Gaspésie? Like, there's just so much there. And I think there are models, and Barry, you mentioned, that there are like hub and spoke models, and I think, or examples that maybe, we need to learn from and capitalize on that. But it's a sufficient use of resources, and those resources are limited, and they come from the government. So, and those metrics come from the government too, faced with the clinician that's there. And I'm a clinician that really values research and does clinical trials. So think about all the clinicians that don't. So where are the incentives for those clinicians? And I think that is a huge barrier. Part of this solution-oriented thinking of solutions could come from patients as well. We've talked about this as well. Like we need to empower patients to be able to demand this. And maybe this goes all the way up to the institution, to the government. I'm not sure. But just as a means to say, how do we drive this change? Who has the power to drive this change? And ultimately, it's money, it's resources. And one last point, I don't want to take up all the time here, but just to say, it's not just doctors, right? There's a lot of people involved in doing research. So it's nurses. I look at my nursing staff, they're really busy, and they're working the entire time. And to ask a nurse to do an extra blood draw on a patient that's involved for research, who's going to make sure that this is part of their job description, that they have the resources and the time to do that? So there's a lot of layers we need to think about when we embed it. Yeah, I think I'll start there.
Thank you. I think we all acknowledge that research is scarce. I think that one important piece is the resources that we need, the funding, because as you mentioned, there's a lot of people involved in a clinical trial. So a research nurse, research coordinator, they need to extract AE, SAE, follow up on a response assessment. It takes a lot of work and a lot of money. And I think right now there's a shift. Let's say there was a recent study led by Access and by Trisha Schneider. It's going to be published eventually, but over 200 clinical trials in ped oncology. And out of these, there was only 10% that were funded by CHIR, whereas 40% were by NIH. And now with the political issue, I think that a lot of this funding will drop. And we all often rely on consortiums and pharma, but we need more national and provincial support in order to support research and institution. And we have more and more consortium trials that we can open, but it's more pay to play, where you need to provide money. And right now it's a challenge. There's not a lot of institution where you can apply to get funding for this type of support. So I think that resources is a big challenge right now, given the cost. And also, if you take the opposite, that the care is research, maybe you can envision something like we see with education. Also, patients, when they come to hospital, they expect they're going to see interns, fellow, resident. Maybe they should expect also that research is part of the institution. And it's maybe more opt-out if you don't want to be part of the research, data collecting, rather than just opt in for every registry, every trial. So it would probably make collecting data a little bit easier.
All right. Well, I guess I have the economics perspective. So, well, let's follow the money. Michael and I haven't talked a lot about what he's doing in his job, but I think one of the things that's interesting in terms of an economic perspective is thinking about the company themselves. I mean, so, in the time it's taken from, everybody to speak, Roche's revenues were probably about $3 million in that short amount of time. So don't they have a ton of money? Well, no. When they make decisions about investing in clinical trials, they think about costs. They think about other things, I think, like capacity to deliver and how fast things can turn around, all the things we've talked about, but they do think about the costs of things. And so one of the things we do have to think about is how do we keep the costs down? I think if we were cheap, there'd probably be a bit more coming here, but it depends. It depends if we have the human resource capacity and all the other things. I'm sure Michael's better at this than I am. Then there's the payer side of things. Who pays? So we benefit greatly in Canada from, considerably more investment in clinical trials than, even our own federal funders. It was a bit sad because, we spend about $300 billion in healthcare, and we spend only, I think the investment in research from a federal side is probably not even 1% of that, I would imagine, which seems like not much when you're thinking about learning healthcare systems. So I think part of the shift should be how could we make that bit grow. But when companies come in, step in, and they do trials, and we did a study in Alberta years ago to look at the value of investment in trials. I think they came up with, in 1 year, it was something like $100 million worth of value. You know, and I think, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's probably a couple $1 billion of research investment by pharmaceutical companies annually, like much more so than probably our federal funders. When we think about that, somebody comes in like Roche, they're studying their new Vabysmo or their Rituxan subcutaneous. Well, they're paying for the drug. They're paying, you know, and they often design trials considering costs and trying to make sure they use things that they don't have to pay too much for. So head-to-head trials become prohibitively expensive if they have to pay for somebody else's drug. But if a payer has to pay, what price do they pay for that drug? You know, do they pay, now they're being asked to pay for maybe a new drug that is unproven. And in cancer, we actually have low failure rates of trials. We have something like 40% failure rates, but that immediately tells you that you shouldn't be paying list price. If you have a 40% chance of failure, you better knock off, you know, a certain amount of price. Plus, prices are obviously not entirely value-based to begin with, which is why we have a Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is renegotiating prices behind the scenes to get something closer to a value-based price. Meanwhile, you know, pharma companies have their target prices in terms of target revenues in the back of their mind. So I do think money has a lot to play, you know, in terms of following the money and thinking about incentives. I think some of the things that were said about financial incentives at the institutional level apply as well. But those are some preliminary thoughts. I don't know if that's helpful.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so now it's your turn to work. So if you guys have any questions, feel free. The microphones are there. Stand up. You know, make some comments, ask questions. As you guys get ready, maybe I'll dive in. Oh, Barry, did you want to? We'll let Barry go, and then.
I'll just break the ice here so we can encourage some others to come up. But one of the things that I was thinking about was not the cost, but the savings. So we talked about perhaps having to do 2 blood draws, but we know that from hearing about research being part of care, well, maybe we can eliminate doing 2 blood draws and just use 1 blood draw. So how can we, Don, think about not just the costs, but what are the savings? I know this is something that we talk about very often when we submit to PCODER. We say there's not just the cost of the drug, but there's also the social impact, the benefit, the cost savings as a consequence. So when we talk about research as care, so we'll bring it back to there's no product yet. We're still just doing the research part. We're recruiting people, and to our healthcare system as a whole, where are the cost savings that we can demonstrate? Because I think that would certainly help to motivate, you know, our decision makers and payers, you know, up front.
So there might be savings, like you said. We have to be careful. So the administrative costs associated with a new cancer therapy, which is going to average like $8,000 a month, are a drop in the bucket compared to the actual cost of often the drug itself. So, you know, your savings might be small. But there's a bigger issue, which is opportunity costs. So we know right now in Canada, there are manufacturers who were doing compassionate trials or compassionate programs using cellular therapies like CAR T therapies. In Ontario, some of those programs were canceled. Why? Well, we can't, you know, they said, well, we can't accommodate the infrastructure. You know, if we are going to use our infrastructure to help to give away free drug, we're actually imposing opportunity on people who actually could be receiving this as part of mainstream care. In other words, we have people that we're actually willing to pay for, but we only have so many nurses and other human resources that are dedicated to toxicity management and all the things that go into complex care. So even though this company wanted to give away, you know, free things, they were told, sorry, the infrastructure's not there for you because if we gave you the infrastructure, that would create waits or whatever. So I agree with you. There might be efficiencies, but there's also, without appropriate capacity for things like, whatever it is, chair time, toxicity management, things that are scarce resources, suddenly you're in a situation where, it becomes a low-value proposition for the healthcare system.
Go ahead, Rebecca.
Yeah, maybe I'll just comment a little bit on that aspect that, I can't speak for all of Canada, but I can tell you the hospitals in Ontario are in really big trouble financially. Unprecedented budget deficits across the board. And I know at our hospital, the Ottawa Hospital, we were working with our CEO and senior team around things like allowing us to book a bed for a novel therapeutic clinical trial. And the sort of managerial response was, we can't book a bed. We have 55 patients in eMERGE that are not admitted. We can't book a bed. We're talking about one bed every month, maybe, for a brand new therapeutic that is exactly aligned with our strategic plan that has had transformational effects in other patients. So what our CEO said was, listen, we'll do this. We'll have 56 people in eMERGE waiting without beds. I think we need to understand that we cannot fix our healthcare system and wait until that's fixed so we start implementing clinical trials. We have to embed it in the culture so that the nurse who doesn't have time to deliver the chemo, we book 10 extra minutes if that patient's on a clinical trial, because the problems are there and they will continue to be there. A number of people have said to me, you've got to fix the knitting before you sew on the lace. We cannot afford to wait and fix the knitting. It's time to embed those clinical trials into our care. That extra blood draw, it's part of what you do because it's part of what we do as an institution, as an ecosystem to embed, research into care. I really think if we wait for the system to be fixed, we'll wait forever.
So I agree because with new therapy, there's new toxicity, and it's difficult to engage, let's say, other specialists. Let's say they have eye toxicity, so they need to see ophthalmo, and we do get a lot of pushback from them. Okay, I don't have a ton of patients, I don't have time to look for toxicity, so that kind of thing. Echo, same thing. So if it's embedded in culture and they understand it's part of their care, at least we can get more buy-in, because if everybody indeed is under pressure from the nurses, physician, and staff.
Kanita?
Yeah, I was just wondering if the panel members have comments around a cooperative model for clinical trials. So I've heard about it. I think I saw it on the Australian slides. Maybe they've implemented it as well as a way to kind of bring clinical trials kind of to Canada, more accessible, and a way to kind of share accountability, share costs. Maybe there's some comments from each of you on that.
So cooperative trials, meaning the multi-jurisdictional, run out of the U.S. or a true cooperative along disease lines, or?
Yeah, so like you'll have kind of multi-institution, maybe private sector. Everyone kind of pays a little bit to contribute, and then also share the accountability of it. Yeah, so the world's kind of going that way right now because there is a lack of funding. Especially academic peer review funding. So researchers are getting together. They're bringing in industry. They're bringing in different countries, hobbling together the money out of necessity. But out of that comes more generalizable results, trial results, greater access to trials. So I think there's a lot of benefit in that. And well, again, the Australians, the Canadians, some of the Brits, the UK, they are getting together to do those trials with industry as well, not just strictly academic. So I see the world going that way because the funding pie is only so large. We haven't grown that.
I'll just comment just to say, like, I think that would be great to integrate more industry partnerships and partnerships across institutions. Part of it could be also how we show when we do clinical trials that, and I think it was Barry that mentioned cost savings, but, how the care that's being given as part of the trial, for example, if it's a nurse that normally does a clinical, as part of the clinical care, as actually also helping that patient, with respect to maybe getting imaging, getting blood work as part of the trial, and maybe some of that funding is coming from the trial itself rather than from the hospital. So there could be sort of ways of, I don't want to say spinning that, but simply just to say, look, it's not take. It's really, there's resources going back into the system as well. So it's, the way how you kind of frame it and think about it, I think, in terms of cost recovery as well. Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of consortium ongoing right now to address this issue. Pharma will be involved often to provide a drug, but there's still a lot of funding in order to go to site by site to pay for patient enrollment, follow-up. So this is where I think we need more national and provincial support in order to participate in these. I think the NSCOG that are open, the consortium in Australia, it has been really successful. There's a lot of Canadian trials open in Australia and back and forth because there's more national support to these trials, and we're lacking this support right now in Canada. So we're often going to use money from industry-sponsored trials in order to cover those consortium, because otherwise we go in deficit for these trials.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks.
Yeah, so there's a few things going on at the same time right now. In the latest draft HEMA report that we're providing input to, one of the things that they talk about is the opportunity cost. The opportunity cost of funding one drug over another drug, for example. And this is sort of like the end game of clinical trials, right? We're looking for going through that whole process until there's a product, and that product, whether it should be reimbursed at whatever cost versus another product. Well, the question of investing in clinical trials in Canada is quite dependent on whether or not there's going to be investment in those drugs. And no company will start a clinical trial in a country that they're not going to launch. Now, faced with what's going on with the most favored nation status in the US, I forget the acronym for it, MFN, I think it is, this may very well impact investment in Canada. So there's an opportunity cost to the industry as a whole. And we have to start thinking in terms of an industry and investment in Canada as a whole. If we want to take an approach like in Australia, we have to think, how do we at a local level consider the development of this investment in Canada when companies have the opportunity to invest other places? Why should they invest in Canada? So we have to demonstrate financially, apart from the patient and the obvious impact on us as citizens, we have to demonstrate that it's a worthwhile investment and that there's an opportunity cost lost by not investing in research and being care. So I think there's a lot of economic analysis that we have to do to demonstrate the necessity to make this investment in Canada. I know Olivier mentioned that on the site of IMC that there is some analysis that's been done, but I think we have to do this to a greater extent. So I'm thinking about where this data is going to come from. So how do we start to gather that data at a local, institutional level, which is not something that's normally captured, and then take it as a national perspective to encourage this type of investment and a change in the way we do clinical trials to encourage that investment?
I want to challenge that just a little bit because, I mean, again, and I was speaking on behalf of Michael, but there are a number of factors that go into where and why you invest in clinical trials globally. So cost is a big factor, but there's a lot that's said about, well, they have poor reimbursement policy, therefore we're not going to. I think that the question I have is, if it was super cheap to go to Canada versus anywhere else because we had some highly specialized capacity like pediatrics, for example, would you really not invest in a clinical trial in Canada, even though you didn't think you could bring it to Canada? I think there are examples where, in fact, that has been done. I know it's a factor, but it's not the overarching factor, I would imagine.
I think just maybe to add into that and maybe throw another question your way, Don, is I agree with you. I think if you made it extremely attractive to bring a clinical trial for the industry, to bring a clinical trial to the country, the downstream decisions are sort of separated from that conversation.
So just to challenge your basic assumption, NIMC's basic assumption.
But I think the other component of maybe funding and the economic story is the other decisions that are related to bringing a clinical trial to the country. So from the perspective of drug funding, if Canada is behind for whatever reason in terms of funding innovation, and we don't have the comparator arm funded in Canada, then it makes it extremely difficult for us to bring these types of clinical trials. And as we see sort of the innovations coming quicker and quicker and more expensive, and those decisions being tougher and tougher to get in Canada, we're starting to see these conversations happen at Global to say, like, we need to bring these trials as quickly as possible into the markets where these drugs are, the comparators are funded, not just, you know, our intervention. I think that's another sort of systems consideration for us to think about.
No, that's a good one, and because there's increased pressure to do head-to-head and that kind of thing. Yeah.
The fundamentals, though, are if we can demonstrate that we can get, you know, from IND contracts, REB approval, first patient enrolled within, you know, 60 days, 70 days, 90 days, that will go a long way of attracting business and industry to Canada, which used to be here, more of. We've lost that. And then, you know, up to the federal government and provincial governments for tax incentives and so forth. But, you know, we need to be more efficient. That's what drove industry away. I mean, was the, you know, the 700 days, 900 days between first contact and a patient being enrolled.
Yes, we'll go to that, Mike, and then we'll go to Kurt.
Michael, you talked about real-world evidence at the beginning of the panel, and I just wanted to circle back to that. So real-world evidence indeed is critical for evaluating effectiveness, value, and also help support reimbursement reviews. But real-world evidence is also messy. So I was wondering, how do we do this better in Canada? Is it better patient education? Because sometimes real-world evidence is very messy. I was wondering if the panel had any comments.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly my jam. So I would love the panelists to speak to this. Is, you know, this concept of care as research. If we're providing routine clinical care and we're collecting all of these data, and arguably real-world data is extremely messy, as you mentioned, and the infrastructure and the fragmentation and all of the things associated with it. How then do we conduct better quality research on, you know, the data we're getting from routine clinical practice?
I mean, just a comment about real-world evidence and reimbursement decisions. If you look at reimbursement reviews, you know, a lot of people think real-world evidence is the same as, you know, demonstrating comparative effectiveness in the real world. That's almost the last thing that it's ever used for because of problems with inference and problems with making comparative assessments and the like. Sometimes it is used, and it's used effectively. Roche itself used, you know, Alberta data once to create inferences about a new drug it had for a blood cancer to create a comparison when they had a single-arm trial, and they did it effectively, and it actually resulted in a positive reimbursement review. But that's an exception, not a rule. Often real-world evidence is, you know, they're much more interested in it to look at utilization patterns, patient switching, and that kind of thing. So it is messy, but it can answer some questions. But in terms of clinical impact, it often doesn't answer those questions well, and that's why we see reimbursement reviews looking towards randomized controlled trials, and what they're hoping for are generalizable, practical, pragmatic, you know, valid types of designs so that they can make inferences about, does this drug actually have a certain amount of benefit? But
Just while we're on that, do you ever see a world where we can build sufficient infrastructure, sufficient whatever you may call it, where we may be able to use real-world evidence for, clinical information, outcomes, effectiveness?
I would hope so. I mean, one of the struggles we see in oncology, for example, so again, when you brought in polatuzumab, you were lucky you were able to find Alberta data that was contemporary and a very similar type of patient population and make very strong inferences about how your drug would have done if you would have introduced it into Alberta. A lot of companies struggle with, particularly in the realm of targeted therapies, they would like to know how their brand new drug, which works in a population with a certain genetic variant, might work in the real world. And they go to the real world data and nobody's been collecting those genetic markers. So, one of the things we need to do to attract clinical trials is to have very good systems of genetic and genomic testing already built in, and including, looking at investigational and future-looking markers so that you can actually then use those data in the real, to do real-world assessments. And I think those kinds of things would be really helpful. But the number of times a company comes to me and says, we're scratching our heads, we can't find any patient group that has these markers because nobody collects that in the real world. I think that's a pretty easily solvable problem. I mean, you have people already doing these panels. It's just a matter of adding another analyte. It's forward-looking. I think it's something that healthcare systems could do, and lo and behold, not only could they attract clinical trial investment, they could attract also real-world investment as well, I would imagine.
I don't know if it's on. Yeah, it is. Just wanted to add, I think there's obviously advantages and disadvantages for real-world data. It can be messy, it's limitations with causal inference, but there's also a lot of advantages. And one of those, I think, is that if we look at the representation of a lot of clinical trials in Canada, they don't adequately represent our patient population that we treat. And that's still a huge barrier that I think, we certainly as a group, as a country, need to work towards improving. So that the metrics of who's actually in the study represent the patients with the disease, right? And there's still huge gaps there. So that's, I think, really helpful. Of course, the actual, you're right, like how clean that data is, and we also have to think about, is it registry-based data, population-level data, is it EHR-level data, and what's missing, what's the missing data, how well this is collected. So obviously you need a really solid data management team, data science involved. There's a lot of infrastructure. There are initiatives happening in Ontario and Quebec with common data models, languages. We have David Buckrich at our institution who's working on some of this using registry-based data. And linking that EHR data with registry data is also a challenge. And there's privacy-related issues, legal issues there that need to be overcome, but really powerful if you are able to do it well. There's also the HDRN, the Health Data Research Network across Canada, which is trying to do some of that work as well. So I think it's really important to invest in that area and continue. And I think using it as endpoints too could be very useful. And a lot of it could be used to inform future trials, or really to get that pilot data that's needed.
I think that even in Ped-Onc, most of our patients are treated off study with targeted therapy. So I think we can either leave this data come on the side, or actually try to use it, even though it's messy and it's challenging. But we have to use these for historical control, or see how this drug work in underrepresented population in specific disease. So I think we should try to leverage these data, but these are challenges. Is it one registry per disease? Is it a general registry? Are we going to extract it from the EMR? So that's the challenge. But for sure, there's a need to use this real-world data to better understand the disease, and can apply to come reimbursement too, but it's really also just to get a sense of the efficacy, especially in this rare disease where there's maybe 20 patients in Canada and so on. So we know that we can try to leverage what has been done in clinic and use it as part of research.
Yeah, so agree with all of what's being said. I think real-world evidence, that access to data, be it local, regional, provincial, national, is critical and a wonderful complement to and supplement to doing trials, for trials. We still, again, there's exceptions, rare diseases, some single-arm trials and so forth, but by and large, to drive practice, we need clinical trials. It's that power of randomization that sorts out what's safe and effective. And I'm all about the efficiencies of doing clinical trials and pragmatic trials and preserving that power of randomization, because we've been led astray on observational only evidence in many different areas. And it speaks to have a true evidence-based medicine requires clinical trials.
Kurt, we'll go to you for.
But just maybe to respond on the randomized trial, I think it's important, but for a lot of like this rare disease, it's becoming more and more challenging. And as we go through molecular testing, specific, it's going to be a challenge. And I think we need to find another way to somehow approve this drug without randomization, because a lot of these clinical trials are actually failing because they cannot accrue enough patients, or we have to find a way to come to better investigate the efficacy through different trial design rather than just randomization. But I think that's still the gold standard, but there's other way to get around. Yeah.
Fully agree. Those are the exceptions, and appreciate those differences.
And just a reflection on the standardization of data, how important that is. It just boggles my mind that, you know, even something as important as progressed disease in cancer, even within the same cancer hospital, you're going to have, if you looked at EHRs, you know, you need AI to make sense of it, or you need somebody to like go through every record because of the way, you know, things are recorded. Hopefully in the world of AI, both AI transcribed EHRs and also combing things, we can sort all that out. But I mean, that's just a simple outcome, and yet hard to, you know, even get from real world data. Sorry, I know you were standing up. And
Now we'll go to you, Kurt. We're ready.
It's a really valuable discussion. I had two supportive comments and then one question. So firstly, on the cooperative group question, I agree with what the panel said. They're important trials. They answer important research questions. They grow capability in staff as well, but they often have budgets that don't cover their costs. So they really only work as a small proportion of your overall trial portfolio. On the reimbursement speed question, again, I agree. I think that there are a range of reasons why large pharma brings trials to any country, and that's one reason. Most trials are started by smaller biotech nowadays, and their goal is generally acquisition by large pharma. It's not necessarily to get to market. So I don't think that reimbursement speed is a big issue, apart from large pharma phase 3 studies. And that then ties into my question. So we're seeing a trend for certain countries to mandate a proportion of their constituents in phase 3 trials if reimbursement is going to be supported in those countries. What do you think about that? Is that a risk to Canada? Is that something you think your market's large enough to implement? Or, you know, Australia's small. That's a risk to Australia, I think.
Can you just repeat the question, Kurt?
So there are certain countries that are now saying, if you don't include 6% of our population in your phase 3 study, we're not going to give you reimbursement or approval.
If you don't include a percentage of the population in phase 3 studies,
so they're forcing you to conduct a phase 3 study in their country.
I mean,
Will that change?
It will definitely affect change. I mean, these are
seems to be increasing this year.
Yeah, you know, I don't. It's the carrot and the stick.
It is. Yeah.
So it will definitely, something like that could definitely affect decisions as to bringing clinical trials to market. I think, again, this is being recorded. So there's certain things I can say and then certain things I'll say at lunch. Yeah. But, you know, for a global pharmaceutical company, the market for Canada is about 2.5% of our entire global market. And so if it's cost prohibitive or if it delays significant development timelines to bring, you know, clinical trials into Canada just to capture the Canadian market, you can imagine that the decision would go against Canada from that perspective. Would we think about it more deeply, of course, but that's sort of the message. And we face these messages not with respect to bringing clinical trials to market, but with pricing discussions and with reimbursement negotiations and these types of things. And we sort of have to understand sort of inside of a global economy where Canada sits and sort of the level of influence that we have on some of these pressure tactics.
I would imagine as well, if it doesn't slow things down, but it increased costs, then ultimately the cost of research is increased, and then we'll just pay for it in the price of the drug. And that's it.
I ask the motivation for that change in Australia. Was it a ethical, moral one, external generalizability, or what was the
Australia
rationale?
Doesn't do it.
Oh, sorry. So
Yeah,
I
Germany's
misunderstood.
recently announced it, for example. I think the US is considering it. It's not something that Australia's implemented.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I misunderstood. I thought someone was doing that.
But Germany's the most recent that I'm aware of.
Could I ask a
So
follow-up question about that, though, just to anybody from industry in the room, which is, what would it take industry to say no to any country that brings that up? Any country that insists on a percentage of trials go to that country if they're ever going to buy their products?
What would it take for us to say no?
Yes.
Size of the market.
Yeah. I mean, yeah.
Not much.
But we're talking about good places to place your trials, right? And by the way, we totally accept we're 2.5% of the market here in Canada. I'm not sure what you are in Australia.
Less.
But we all work really hard on speed, cost, quality, predictability, because we hear from industry, you fix all those things and we're going to bring more trials here. And then when you bring in those market considerations, and by the way, I think we all get the big picture around it, we do, but to have countries that can, let's say, throw around more weight, insist that they get more of the trials, what would it take for you guys to say, no, we're going to go after speed, quality, and consistently, like we've always said?
Yeah, no, I get your question now, Susan. So again, it's the carrot and the stick. I think if the carrot is extremely attractive, we have the speed, we have the quality, we have the infrastructure for low-cost clinical trials. That carries much more weight, and it's much more of a realistic scenario to play out than these. I mean, maybe realistic's the wrong word, but a much more favorable conversation for us to have as we're bringing clinical trials to market. We don't want to say no, but if you're caught between a rock and a hard place and the decision is whether or not you put at risk the commercial viability of this product by having to place clinical trials, and I don't think that's the case, right? Like I think there's enough effort in Canada to ensure that if we had to bring a certain percentage of patients into clinical trials in Canada, it's not a risk. If it were a risk, I'm just saying, if it were a economic risk, a financial risk, a development risk for the product, that's where we have to make these tough decisions between, is it a market viable product in Canada? Does that?
Kind of.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about this, the kind of stick thing, if countries are using the stick, right, to say you have to put your trials here or else, and in this amount, or else you can't sell your products here. That'll be harder on countries with smaller markets.
Yeah, I mean,
sure.
I think a country who is deploying that stick is not a country who has the clinical trial infrastructure that will put at risk our commercial viability of our products. I think, a country who has a focus on bringing clinical trials into the country is working on their clinical trial infrastructure so that it is attractive for us to bring it. So again, I don't want to dismiss the question. I think it's a very valid question. Yeah. I think it's a scenario that is probably an edge case where we would do, our due diligence in looking into that market for sure.
Thanks, Michael.
I think maybe the reason I raise it is it helps you think about what the not Roche, but Canada as a country, it helps you think about where you prioritize or what sort of trials you want to attract. Yeah. So if the influence of that policy is latter phase trials, then maybe your focus is more early phase trials, which won't be affected by that. And maybe that suits you better anyway. Previously, latter phase trials recruited large numbers of patients at every centre that was involved. That's not the case anymore. You probably know from Roche's experience, phase 3 cancer trials recruit 5 patients per site, just like a phase 1 trial nowadays. Yeah. So there's not as not as much financial attractiveness of latter phase trials anyway.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Thank you. Appreciate the discussion.
We're actually at time. Okay. So I just wanted to thank the panelists. I think I sort of threw a curveball there. I did send through some questions that I told them I was going to ask them, and then I totally changed it and made it about you guys. So very much appreciate the flexibility, the bravery of sitting up here talking about this topic. I think, you know, it's lunchtime now. I think we can go ahead, continue these conversations at the lunch tables, and have very, very transparent conversations.
Just before we go for lunch, though, I don't want everybody to get up. We have 2 important things to do, so come on off, guys. Thank you so much, Michael, for a beautifully managed panel. Dean, Sushmita. Yes, I got it. I got it. There's a polling question that I want everyone to answer because it will be fundamental for some of the commentary that gets created for wrapping this up. So here's the question. What would help justify a business case for embedding research into care? Rank your top 3. One of the questions I had wanted to ask as part of that last panel is whether or not any work has in fact been done on building a business case for embedding care into research, or research into care. People are still voting. That's great. Okay. Thank you so much for